Somebody in your group is dead, not in a hospital, not in a building, out in the open. 50,000 years ago, in a world with no graves, no priests, no rituals, no written traditions, no instructions for what to do next. The person who was alive this morning, who hunted with you yesterday, who slept near the same fire last night, is now completely still. And the rest of your small group of maybe 30 people is standing there looking at the body. What do? Do you leave it? Do you bury it? Do you grieve? Do you even understand what death is in the way we understand it today? These questions sound simple, but they are not. Because what humans did with their dead turns out to be one of the most revealing windows we have into how our ancestors thought, felt, and understood the world around them. And what the evidence shows is not what most people expect. The first thing to understand is that dealing with death is not uniquely human. Many animals respond to the death of group members in ways that suggest at least some form of recognition that something has changed permanently. Elephants are the most well-documented example. When an elephant dies, the other members of the group will often stand near the body for extended periods, touching it gently with their trunks, sometimes covering it with dirt and branches, sometimes returning to the site of a death months or years later and interacting with the bones. Chimpanzees have been observed carrying dead infants for days or even weeks after death, grooming them, refusing to put them down, apparently unable or unwilling to fully process the loss. Crows and ravens gather near dead members of their species in what researchers describe as something resembling a vigil. These behaviors suggest that the impulse to acknowledge death, to do something in response to it rather than simply walking away, is older than our species. It is built into social animals at a level that precedes human civilization by an enormous margin. But what humans did with death went further than any other species, and the evidence for this goes back much further than most people realize. The oldest known burial site in the world is not from modern humans. It is from a species called Homo naledi, a small-brained, primitive member of the human family that lived in South Africa somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 years ago. In a cave system called the Rising Star Cave, researchers discovered a chamber so deep and so difficult to reach that the only plausible explanation for why bodies ended up there is that other members of the group deliberately carried them in. These were not modern humans. Their brains were roughly a third the size of ours. They did not have language in any form we would recognize. They almost certainly did not have anything we would call religion or philosophy. And yet they were intentionally placing their dead in a specific, difficult-to-reach location rather than leaving them where they fell. The impulse to do something deliberate with the bodies of the dead is apparently ancient beyond what we previously imagined. Among Neanderthals, who lived from roughly 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, the evidence for deliberate burial is well established and genuinely moving when you sit with what it implies. In multiple sites across Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal individuals have been found buried in positions that strongly suggest intentional placement. Bodies positioned on their sides with knees drawn up toward the chest. Bodies oriented in specific directions. In some cases, objects found near the body that may have been placed there deliberately. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, one Neanderthal individual was found surrounded by pollen from multiple species of wildflowers, leading to decades of debate about whether Neanderthals placed flowers on their dead. The flower burial interpretation has been contested, but the broader pattern of deliberate, careful burial is not seriously questioned. Neanderthals buried their dead. They chose locations. They positioned bodies with apparent care, and this was happening tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. Among early modern humans, the burial record becomes even richer. One of the most famous early modern human burials is the so-called Red Lady of Paviland, found in Wales and dated to roughly 33,000 years ago. Despite the name, the skeleton is actually a young man, covered in red ochre, buried with carved ivory rods, perforated shell ornaments, and what appear to be the remains of a mammoth skull. The red ochre is significant. It appears in burial contexts across many different ancient cultures and many different time periods, always associated with the dead. Nobody knows for certain what it meant, but it clearly meant something. People were not randomly painting their dead red. They were doing it deliberately, consistently, across enormous spans of time and geography, which means the practice was being passed down, taught, maintained as a meaningful act across generations. This points to something that goes deeper than just disposing of a body. These early humans were not just solving a practical problem. They were performing something. They were marking the death of a specific individual in a way that required effort, required resources, required the participation of other group members. They were, in other words, doing something that looks a great deal like what we would recognize as a funeral. Not identical to any modern funeral, but shaped by the same underlying impulse. The person who died mattered. The death deserved acknowledgement. Something should be done that was different from what you would do with an ordinary piece of the natural world. But what about grief itself? Did ancient humans actually feel grief the way we do? This is a harder question to answer because emotions leave no direct fossil record. But there are indirect ways to get at it. The careful treatment of the dead, the apparent effort invested in burial, the objects placed with bodies, all of this strongly suggests emotional investment in the individuals who died. You do not carve ivory ornaments and place them with someone's body if that person meant nothing to you. You do not carry a body deep into a cave system if you feel nothing about what happened. The behavior we observe in the archaeological record implies a level of attachment to specific individuals that is incompatible with purely cold, emotionless social organization. There is also the matter of what happened to bodies that were not buried, because burial was not the universal practice. In many ancient and traditional societies, the dead were handled in very different ways. Some groups practiced sky burial, leaving bodies on elevated platforms or open ground to be consumed by birds and other scavengers. Some groups practiced excarnation, deliberately removing the flesh from bones through various means, and then treating the cleaned bones differently from the fleshed body, sometimes keeping them, sometimes placing them in communal bone deposits, sometimes using them as objects of ongoing ritual significance. Some groups appear to have practiced a form of secondary burial, initially placing the body somewhere temporarily, then returning after decomposition to collect and rebury the bones in a final location. All of these practices are different from each other, but they share the same underlying structure. Death demands a response. The body of a dead group member is not ordinary matter to be ignored. It is something that requires deliberate human action, guided by shared understanding of what is appropriate. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of this record is the evidence for cannibalism in some ancient populations. This is not comfortable to discuss, but it is part of the honest answer to what ancient humans did with their dead. At multiple sites across prehistoric Europe, human bones have been found with cut marks consistent with butchering, with marrow extraction, with the same processing patterns found on the bones of animals used for food. In some cases, this appears to have been straightforward survival cannibalism in times of extreme scarcity. But in other cases, the pattern is more complex and harder to interpret simply as a food source. Some researchers believe certain forms of ancient cannibalism were ritualistic rather than nutritional. Consuming the flesh or the bones of a powerful or beloved group member may have been understood as a way of incorporating their strength, their spirit, or their essence into the living. This practice appears across many different ancient cultures with no contact with each other, which suggests it was an independent response to the same underlying human question. What do we do with the power that a person contained when that person is gone? What all of this evidence adds up to is a picture of ancient humans who were, in some deeply important sense, exactly like us in their relationship with death. Not in the specific rituals, not in the theological explanations, not in the precise form of what they did, but in the core recognition that death is not nothing, that the person who died was not nothing, and that something needs to happen in response. The cognitive leap required to bury your dead, to place objects with a body, to return to a gravesite, to feel the specific weight of a particular person's absence, rather than simply registering that the group has one fewer member, is the same cognitive leap that eventually produced every funeral tradition, every philosophy of what happens after death that humans have ever developed. There is one more thing worth saying about this. The fact that ancient humans buried their dead, grieved their dead, and marked the deaths of specific individuals tells us something that is easy to miss if you are focused on the bones and the ochre and the grave goods. It tells us that ancient humans loved each other, not in some abstract evolutionary sense, in the specific individual sense. They knew who had died. They felt the difference between a world that contained that person and a world that did not. They did something to mark that difference because the difference was real and it mattered to them. The archaeology of ancient death is, in the end, archaeology of ancient love, of what it felt like to be a member of a small group of people in a dangerous world, to depend on each other completely, and to lose someone who was irreplaceable. The grief that ancient humans felt standing over the bodies of their dead is the same grief that exists today. The world that contained that person and the world that no longer does. That distance, that loss, that silence where a person used to be, that has not changed at all.